Okay, hello, welcome everyone. My name is Srila Roy, and I'm an associate professor of sociology at Wits University, where I lead a research project called Governing Intimacies. I hope some of you, at least, who are joining us today are familiar with the project. We ran quite a successful webinar series last year, and this year we're doing a new series called Intimate Archives. We've had some fabulous sessions so far. We've talked about we've looked at a new work theorizing gender on the African continent. We've looked at the post-colonial, the sexual politics, sorry, the post-colonial politics of sexuality. We've looked at queerness, religion, and the last one was on the sexual politics of the growing global right wing. And I'm going to put in a link at the bottom to our YouTube channel, so in case you've missed any of these sessions, you can look at the past recordings. We've tried to curate the session with a specific perspective on and from the African continent, but also engaging in a more comparative analysis, particularly with scholars in India, which is basically the remit of the Governing Intimacies project, which is to look at gender and sexuality between Southern Africa and India. So today we're going to talk about the global AIDS crisis, and we're going to listen to three speakers looking at the travels and trajectories of the global AIDS crisis on India, Kenya, and Mozambique. I'm just going to introduce the speakers to you now, and they're going to speak in the order that I introduce them to you. They're going to speak for not more than 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussant who's going to respond to them. We'll give the speakers an opportunity to respond to the discussant, and then we'll open it up to your questions. As I said at the beginning, please feel free to introduce yourselves using the chat function. And when you want to ask a question, actually, we're very flexible. You can use, put your questions in the chat itself, or you can use the Q&A function. Okay, so I am super delighted to welcome our speakers today. Our first speaker is Gauri Vijayakumar, who's an assistant professor of sociology and women's and gender and sexuality studies at Brandeis. Gauri is, Gauri's book project is just hot off the press. I'm going to put in a link here to it. It's called At Risk, Indian Sexual Politics and the Global AIDS Crisis with Stanford University Press. And I'm hoping very much we're going to hear about the book today, Gauri. I'm very, very excited to hear about it. Ostensibly, the book draws on her ethnographic fieldwork from India and Kenya, which looks at the relationships, the contestations between sex workers, LGBTQ activists, and HIV prevention programs. Welcome, Gauri. She's going to be joined by Francisco Miguel, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the State University of Campinas. Francisco holds a PhD in social anthropology at the University of Brasilia, and he's the author of a book on homosexualities in the African archipelago. He's also one of the 2020 Colin Murray Award for postdoctoral research in Southern Africa. And Francisco, you said you had some book projects at the moment. Again, please feel free to drop us a little link so we can look up and read your work at leisure. Our discussant today is Devjyoti Ghosh, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Sociology at the University of Pretoria, at this Department of Sociology, sorry, at the University of Pretoria here in South Africa. Devjyoti is trained as a human rights lawyer and has been involved in queer rights activism and also HIV/AIDS issues in India. And his academic research has worked on transgender rights in India, Brazil, and South Africa. Welcome, Devjyoti. Okay, so let's start with Gauri. I'm sorry, I'm rushing a bit because as audiences in South Africa will appreciate, but maybe those elsewhere don't, we might all be plunged into darkness within an hour. So we're going to try and speed things up to give all of you in the audience the most available time to chat with our panelists. So over to you, Gauri.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for organizing this amazing discussion and for that wonderful introduction. I'm gonna share my screen, if that's okay. And I'll just say also that, and thanks, Sheila, for mentioning my book. It's actually gonna be out in the end of July. So in the meantime, if anybody is interested in kind of reading more about my work, feel free to email me. I'll put my email address in the chat when I'm done talking. Can everybody see the slides? Okay. So what I'll try to do now is kind of give you a broad picture of what the book does. And I'm focusing specifically on the chapter that draws on, which I thought would be appropriate for this forum, the archive. And my work is ethnographic, but so I'll try to gesture a little bit at the end at sort of what the stakes of some of what I'll talk about are in my ethnographic research, but I'll focus today on kind of what the archive tells us about contestations and frictions within the space of HIV management and institutions. And more broadly, my book grapples with questions that I think are really central to what the Governing Intimacies Project is working to illuminate, which is kind of how South-South articulations unfold and how they unfold within particular kinds of material conditions, global inequalities, global geopolitics, load shedding patterns, all of these kinds of specific discursive and material conditions under which South-South articulations take place. And here I'll focus specifically on kind of racial hierarchies of nations, or gendered and sexualized hierarchies of nations. So one of the big questions of my book is essentially, how do states and medical experts understand viral contagion through existing geographic imaginaries? And how are those imaginaries underpinned by ideas of sexuality? So AIDS seems like the ideal or even kind of an exceptional case for understanding this. But what I hope I can do is show you how much of this is relevant beyond AIDS. Of course, we've seen recently the tragic consequences of the relationship between disease management and the promise, or really the shattered promise of the nation state. So what I'll do here is kind of focus on the first chapter of my book, but you'll see that some of there's a certain circularity to some of the discourses that we see playing out. Here's just one example, just to kind of keep in your mind as I'm talking about kind of the early politics of AIDS in India. So from the very beginning, the question of whether AIDS was really a crisis for India was contested. In 1994, the director of the newly formed National AIDS Control Organization described a really alarming rise in HIV in the Journal of the Indian Medical Association. He wrote, "The trends in Bombay, in fact, are quite comparable to the trends earlier observed in some of the African states like Nairobi, Addis Ababa. From mid-80s onwards, the trends are so similar as to forewarn us about the impending epidemic of HIV involving the general population, as has happened in these African countries." So this is sort of one discourse about the danger, the specter of AIDS, and a trajectory that might follow the trajectory of that had unfolded in Africa. On the other hand, a 1995 editorial in the same journal worried that AIDS might just be a prelude to test the so-called AIDS vaccine on the Asian people. So the author concluded that AIDS was in fact being disseminated from the developed countries, notorious for their permissive society. You can already see here a hint at the kind of tensions and debates facing the post-colonial nation state in the face of AIDS. So on the one hand, there's this sort of specter of disease and a trajectory like Africa's trajectory of AIDS. On the other, this specter of subjugation by the West, right? And specifically the kind of sexual permissiveness, moral depravity of the West that sort of threatens the Indian moral nation state. So let me back up for a minute and say that when I first started working on this project, I was really interested in kind of how social political theorists use the metaphor of the virus as they describe the dynamics of capitalism and neoliberalism. So this is from a 2002 essay by Jamie Peck and Adam Tickell, where they write that viruses are dangerous, of course, because they spread, and bodies politic, while they may exhibit differing degrees of resistance, are rarely immune to all the strains. So here they're talking about neoliberalism, right? Today we hear a lot of kind of variations on this, right? We hear that capitalism is the virus, that racism is the virus. And usually when people say use the concept of the virus like this, they're referring to how viruses spread quickly, they're deadly, and they're everywhere, right? But if you know how viruses work, you know that they don't actually meet the technical definition of life on their own, right? They operate by repurposing the life of the organism, and they mutate, so they bear the imprint of the places they've been. So it's actually a really good metaphor for neoliberal capitalism, as well as for how discourses of disease operate. So what I'm going to try to show is that HIV institutions and management practices adapted and drew life from specific ecologies of sexual politics and specific imaginaries of the racialized and sexualized nation. So now we'll come back to India in the 1990s. So what you could already see from the examples I started with was how the specter of AIDS was animated by symbolic geographies. So one reference point was the West. So there was a binary between Western sexual degeneracy, permissiveness, material excess, in contrast to India's moral virtue. And we see here this kind of image from public health campaigns of the time. I'll show you a couple of others. But you can see how they emphasize this kind of monogamous heterosexual home against the dangers of foreign sex, and in particular, homosexuality as a Western indulgence. So here's an Indian expert who told the press that the homosexuality percentage in India was 5 to 15% homosexuals, compared to 40 to 60% in the United States. So in the Indian literature, a lot of scholars have written about these post-colonial binaries of Western and Indian sexuality, but less has been written about the idea of Africa in these Indian discourses. So usually these are kind of thought about and written about separately in relation to kind of discourses of the West. But as Cindy Patton writes, global imaginaries of AIDS can be mapped directly onto pre-existing national and cultural formations, and the idea of Africa is central to those. So one of the things I try to do in my book is actually kind of think India and the idea of Africa together, and also specifically kind of Indian and African public health experts, right? Specifically Kenyan public health experts, but I also talked to some in South Africa who are kind of understanding the geographies of AIDS in relation to one another, and always informed by these kind of racialized discourses of Indian modernity and African crisis. So if you look at the medical literature on AIDS in India in the 1980s and the 1990s, a lot of the discussions about whether the epidemic in India looks similar to Africa or not. And we kind of saw that in the early pieces I showed you. So ultimately, experts settled on the idea that India had a heterosexual epidemic instead of a homosexual epidemic, which was one of the concerns early on, right? So the idea of Africa was actually key to this, and the trajectory of African AIDS was key to this. So essentially, India was more like Africa than the West, right? And the category used most often is sub-Saharan Africa, but the language sort of changes in different sources. So in my book, I explore how these were often the same Canadian and US researchers who were doing studies in, for example, Nairobi, and then moving, for example, to northern rural Karnataka to sort of reproduce these forms of expertise and these categories and these models of disease spread. So this expertise also had concrete effects on state repression of two groups in particular, sex workers and Africans, or more euphemistically, a pool of infected women and foreign students. For example, in Tamil Nadu, medical authorities detained some 800 sex workers for mandatory testing and confinement. They were often left with limited food and access to medical care, cut off from their families. There were women who died in this confinement. After an African student was found to be HIV positive, the Indian Ministry of Health announced in October 1986 that AIDS testing was compulsory for all foreign students seeking admission to Indian universities. And by 1987, 11 African students had already been deported. So African students protested these racist guidelines by boycotting the test. And in February 1987, African students organized a protest march in Delhi, arguing that the testing constituted medical apartheid. So this repression also happened famously with Dominic D'Souza, who was a gay man, but state HIV policy tended to focus more on these other groups until kind of more into the 2000s. So these incidents reflected a specific kind of spatial and temporal disease cartography. So as Siddharth Dubey, an AIDS activist, wrote, Africa's present HIV/AIDS caused hell is very probably India's future. So in my book, I talk about how mechanisms of statistical modeling, citational practice, and transnational research partnerships reinforced these kinds of forewarnings, as Manjri Mahajan calls them, of India's AIDS trajectory. By the time I did fieldwork 20 years later, this narrative had been replaced by a narrative of India's success in contrast to Africa's failure. So for example, this is a 2015 article that notes how India can look back with some success at its programs, arguing that it's different from the sub-Saharan Africa that it was predicted to become. So I studied how Indian experts actually traveled to Kenya at this period in the epidemic to train Kenyan medical and public health experts on some of the methods and techniques they had used to track HIV prevention in India. But again, we can emphasize here the animating role of sexuality. So the post-colonial nation had managed to distinguish itself from Western sexual permissiveness, but also unchecked African sexuality as it positions itself as modern and capable of disease management. And it was within this geography that queer death in India was erased, while cisgender women in sex work were violently surveilled. In the US and in South Africa, critical scholars of AIDS have said that the gentrification of memories of AIDS activism has happened kind of in the shadows of a presumed white, elite, cis male gay epidemic. And there's writing about this same phenomenon in South Africa. In an obverse way, epidemiological characterizations of India's heterosexual epidemic, driven by poor female sex workers, helped reinforce the state's insistence that there was no such thing as Indian homosexuality. And these erasures were produced in relation to each other within a global field of public health expertise. And the notable thing is that all of this happened despite the fact that there were so many examples of AIDS activism and solidarity between and across gay and lesbian activists, trans activists, and sex worker activists throughout kind of the early and later periods of AIDS activism in India. So I'll just try to say a little bit about kind of directions or thoughts about COVID-19 and sort of how we might think about this today. So today, as India's new role on the world stage is consolidated, we see how COVID management and drug production are tied to a claim to India's new global position and Narendra Modi's effort to be kind of the leader of a new world power, right? And we've seen that this actually has really quite devastating consequences for what's happened in India around COVID management. But this is actually part of kind of a broader formation of Modi's sort of view of India and the world. So the so-called Modi doctrine includes an anticipated $150 billion in bilateral trade with African countries by 2023, and health diplomacy is a centerpiece of that policy. We can sort of understand the sort of insistence on exporting vaccines when vaccination within India has failed so dramatically within that sort of context. But even as COVID-19 becomes an opportunity for India to flex its muscles as an emergent power, the morality politics it elicits echo some of the legacies of AIDS panic. So let me give you one example and then I'll end. In 2020, researchers at Harvard and Yale medical schools published a study arguing that red light districts were a key source of disease. Sex worker activists reported that police began harassing sex workers and demanding bigger bribes and referencing the study because it actually was circulating in both in the English and vernacular language media. So VAMP is a collective of sex workers based in Sangli, Maharashtra, which some of you in the audience are probably familiar with. So they got together and talked about this study, and they actually formulated a response in multiple languages. And the article they ended up publishing, which you can find on Medium, is a series of proposals for research in Connecticut and Massachusetts. So they proposed, for example, an obesity audit of Cambridge and a study of the sewers in Connecticut. And so the kind of argument here is, if you're going to research us, we can also research you, and we can research your social life and why it produces disease. So I want to just end here because I think it's a small example of how sex workers upended and overturned the racial and sexual geographies through which medical expertise is produced and contagion is imagined. So thanks. I'll stop there and I'll close my slides. I'll just put my email address in the chat if anyone wants to reach out.
Sure,
Thank you so
fabulous.
much.
Thank you, Gauri. We'll go straight to Francisco.
Can you hear me? Cool. First, I'd like to thank Caio for the invitation and to thank Shirila, Gauri, and Chipo to be here with you. I'm very happy to be here. Well, my communication is just a small part of my PhD dissertation. I will talk about a paper of mine that was published recently, titled International Cooperation, Homosexuality, and AIDS in Mozambique. I will share with you the link after. In my ethnographic study, I tried to demonstrate not only the various process of the institutionalization of modern homosexuality in the history of Mozambique, within the government, media, LGBT movement, religions, families, and in the lived experiences of my interlocutors, but also to historically reconstruct the region of Lambda, which is the largest and most active LGBT organization in the country. And I also investigated some of its current and historical guidelines too. The goal was to understand how Lambda would act as one of what I call the agents of the institutionalization of modern homosexuality in Mozambique, based on Mary Douglas' concept of institution. Well, given the great volume of data that could be extracted from the various activities Lambda is involved in, I have chosen to analyze only the TLPFA project, a name I use it to not identify the real donors. It's one of the projects funded by international partners aimed at combating the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Mozambique by targeting the local LGBT communities. This activity is Lambda's biggest focus, since the organization spends the most of the financial resources and has more people involved. My objective here was to demonstrate, first, how, given the international flow of financial resources attached to certain agendas, this project ends up somehow institutionalizing a homosexuality project in Mozambique, in addition to reviving potential new colonial practices. And two, how external bureaucratic practices clash with local cultural ones. So I highlight 4 issues in this paper. First issue, the emphasis placed by international partners on the sexual health of African LGBT people, and more particularly of men who have sex with men, the so-called MSM, to the detriment of advocacy projects, scientific research, or activities that promote LGBT entertainment or visibility of these groups in their respective countries. The second issue is about racism and new colonialism. For example, the complaint of activists about the donor's propensity to change the local organizational charts. Another example is the fact that European partners admit their colonial discomfort in exercising the role of overseeing the project's activities, as one of them had to keep asking questions to the HIV-positive patients in the hospitals, many of whom were in precarious health, which often required these patients to overly expose themselves. A third issue, a certain disregard for the consequences generated in Mozambique by the type of agenda imposed by these donors. The donors are not very concerned about changing local cultural patterns. For example, the gender and sexual terminologies. As an activist from one of these international organizations told me once, in one of his missions to teach about gender and AIDS issues, he met an old woman from the North Mozambican countryside. She was probably illiterate. She reported having a brother who, in her view, fit the profile of the homosexual subject, to which for the first time in her life, she was introduced to by the activist himself. In that context, until then, there did not seem to be a name to identify a subject who combined celibacy, aversion to women, and above average male affections. For the older woman's brother, socially maladjusted as he was, there was no name in their native language. There was no specific identity. He was simply, at the same time, a celibate, someone who had an affective sexual aversion to women, and a man who enjoyed the company of other men. The man himself, according to his sister, attributed the cause to the spirits. But the composition of a specific subjectivity centered on sexuality did not seem to exist. The subject that was new to the cognitive and linguistic apparatus of the Mozambican activist was introduced to the old woman's vocabulary through an easily demonstrable chain to understand her brother, an individual who until then was just a strange person. Uh, Another ethnographic issue that I highlight here in terms of this type of action by Lambda and international organizations has to do with NGOization, a concept I borrowed from Dihan, which means the bureaucratization of the LGBT movement. In Mozambique, I observed how this process of NGOization comes up against an important value of Mozambican and other African subjects, silence and discretion regarding their sexual lives, especially about homoerotic practices. Some examples could be briefly mentioned, such as the dilemma between the need to verify the veracity of the information provided by the beneficiaries of the project, for example, about their sexual identity or serological status, and to respect their privacy. Or example, the question of whether one of the testing concealing services is within the Lambda headquarters, which would scare off people who are not yet assumed to be LGBT, and therefore would not want to be seen join a non-LGBT organization. Another example, the time and location where the mobile testing would take place to avoid exposing the users in daylight and in place with lots of people. And the final example, the question of whether the cards with the result of HIV tests should be delivered immediately to the beneficiaries, because friends who are all together could see them. So based on an ethnographic study carried out in 2018 in southern Mozambique, in this paper, I hope I demonstrated my central argument that the flow of financial resources and concepts through cooperation projects established between international organizations and Lambda can end up institutionalize a homosexuality project in Mozambique. Firstly, institutionalization associates certain sexual practices and identities and identifies them with the dimension of sexually transmitted disease to the detriment of other locally important guidelines, such as combating discrimination or establishing safe spaces for conviviality and leisure for these populations. In addition, such an emphasis on the sexual life of LGBT Mozambicans would reveal potential new colonial practices by subjecting Africans only to their sexual dimension, they complain. Finally, it's also possible to realize that in addition to the imposition of external terminology, exogenous bureaucratic practices end up being in conflict with local cultural wants. For example, when the requirement for registration of those served is against the general Mozambican custom of sexual discretion. I observed inconsistencies between service providers and the target audience of these services. Moreover, in some interviews with beneficiaries, many of them report the importance of Lambda because it provides not only a better understanding of their existence in the world, but also the importance of their sexual health. And I finish here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisco. Okay, so we're just going to hear the Jyoti respond very quickly to both of the presentations. Go for it, Jyoti.
Thank you, Srila. Thanks so much, Gauri and Francisco. Both of you really made my head go a buzz with so many different things. And as I'm sure the audience has already realized, there's so much similarity in the way things are approached within different areas of the global south. The transnational aspects are so self-evident in different ways. One of the first things that really strikes me is the way the African embodiment is brought about, whether it's in India as the carrier of HIV/AIDS, or whether it is the person who needs to be controlled by the foreign donors in Mozambique. Then the other thing that really strikes me is the terminology. For instance, in Francisco's paper, he mentions the notion of MSM being brought about, and the person who's talking about MSM doesn't identify with that term at all. He says that, no, for me, sex is about affection. It is not about just general lust and, or experimentation. And that is also something that we see happening in India as the HIV discourse starts becoming more expansive and creates that negotiating platform for new genders and sexualities to be discussed. And perhaps one of the things that really stands out for me is the shift away from the West into the global South, especially if one can look at Africa as a whole. As problematic as that is, but looking at the notion of the heterosexuality of HIV on some level, which kind of is a parallel to be drawn with India, where, and also what Gauri points out in her work about the sex workers being the primary target in the beginning of the HIV controlling mechanisms, and also the prevention mechanisms that started happening. And of course, like India's used NACO, or the National AIDS Control Program, as a very interesting nation building exercise in a way, where it showed that yes, we are here, we are a developing country, but we are capable of controlling something which has ravaged other countries in the global South. And then out comes this new specter of including this so-called category of MSM, transgender, hijras, decriminalized categories, the categories who nobody speaks about, who are shadows in the mainstream, right? And then, as a parallel, we see the same thing happening in Mozambique when it comes to big NGOs taking over and trying to create new narratives around this. And Lambda plays a very big role over there. There's no doubt Lambda does some great work, but is it landing up using a language narrative which is definitely not indigenous, definitely not native, and creating an elite level of queerness, an elite level of LGBT movements, and also this need, I'm sure even Gauri must have noticed this in our work in India, a lot of people who are part of the LGBT movement often find themselves politically on different sides of the border depending on what terminology they are using. And like a trans person versus a hijra, a male to female trans person, female to male trans person, gender non-binary person. There's so many different aspects. But when it comes to donor language, we have to land up writing what the donor wants, satisfying their needs, their quantitative data mechanisms. So keeping all that in mind, two questions that really come up for me is, Gauri, when you were working in India, how much of the NGOization, which Francisco also talks about, really affected the way you collected your data? And how did you see it creating the narrative around HIV, around gender and sexual minorities? And I will also pose my question for Francisco over here. Do you think, like, given the fact that you have actually I wouldn't say you've put Lambda in a negative light, but you have definitely put them in a position where you're saying they're institutionalizing homosexuality in Mozambique. Do you think there's a way out of this? Where a local language, a local narrative can be created, perhaps through Lambda, perhaps without Lambda, instead of capturing beneficiaries, as you call them, where the beneficiaries embrace Lambda's own language. So these are my questions for the two of you. Thank you so much.
Are you both happy to have a go? Or, I mean, there's already a very interesting question that's come up for Gauri, so we could wait for a couple more, or why don't we all have a stab at NGOization? It's only like my pet topic. And we'll get some more questions coming in. Gauri, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, actually, I think I was just going to say that I've learned so much from Shrila's work about sort of how to think about NGOization. So I'd love to hear from you too. But I think, I mean, so you asked the question in terms of how it affected how I collected my data. So I'll start there. I mean, I think, you know, so for me as an ethnographer moving into doing research on this topic, you know, one of the things I quickly realized was that this was not the environment of, you know, an ethnographer kind of intrepidly going into some unresearched terrain, which is of course never true. But in this case, you know, there's a very particular kind of politics and history and, you know, a quite grim history of researchers, right? That was always sort of part of how I interacted on these terrains. And so, you know, in the beginning, I sort of experienced it as a limitation, right? Trying to convince people like, I am not with the Gates Foundation. I am not a public health researcher. I'm really just here to spend time and hang out with you. And that was something that sort of took a lot of kind of work and also, you know, continued accountability, I think, which is an ongoing and often incomplete project, I would say. But also I think it's a very rich site because of that, because it kind of forces us as researchers to sort of think about, well, what are our stakes in this? How did we find our way into the field? And how does that sort of contribute to the idea of certain groups and certain sites as sort of sites of crisis or not crisis? So I think, yeah, so, you know, this was part of the data. And I think I'll also kind of answer the question in a more kind of, in a more broad brushstrokes. One of the things I try to show in my book is that NGOization, in the context I studied wasn't always a simple sort of bureaucratization or imposition of global norms on a local reality, because NGOs are varied in their politics and in the kinds of ways that they articulate problems and in the alliances they create. So there are some NGOs, and those are the ones that tend to get more public health funding. They tend to have the kind of more academic publications, the more exposure for their statistical research. But they're not the only NGOs, right? So there are also NGOs, and you know, I've talked to people who described it as, you know, NGOs who imagine themselves to be social movements or who are linked to social movements and who are actually working within the NGO structure to build alliances outside the NGO structure in order to kind of turn the NGO infrastructure in on itself. And I think, you know, if we look at how social movement mobilization sort of emerged out of the AIDS moment in India, you know, we can see that, right? NGOs were a limiting force, but they were kind of a, you know, I heard lots of different words. I always asked people this question. They describe it as a catalyst, a platform, you know, but it's and in Kenya, you know, I've heard people kind of describe it as AIDS is a place we can hide in, right? To talk about sexuality. So, you know, I think we need to be able to think about NGOs as a sort of actually existing structure that can't be denied, but that, you know, groups engage with strategically in sometimes very creative ways that I try to document in my book. But, you know, it always has these constraints that, you know, Francisco has laid out so beautifully. So yeah, I'll stop there because I'd love to hear from the others about this question.
Well, I guess it's my time now. Well, I think there is no way out, I guess. Lambda has to deal with both publics, the donors and the beneficiaries, and they have to negotiate it. And I guess they are doing a very good job, as you said. But at the same time, there are power relations in these negotiations. And I think that our work as researchers is to investigate it and to share with people this data. I really don't know how to escape it. I think that's the how can I say, the way people has to deal with power relations. Basically, they have to both negotiate, and I think that's it.
I just want to make one quick observation here. Gauri, you mentioned the entire notion of crisis handling, and I think Francisco does a very good job of explaining that in his paper, because I think the parallel is obviously very much there, because when you're negotiating with HIV, you're not just negotiating with HIV, you're looking at marginalized populations, daily wages getting lost, lack of health services being available, the lack of a welfare state to take care of you on any level. And like a crisis could be as small as not being able to get fresh water today, or it could be like you losing your life. So it could span the entire thing. And then you have international NGOs who just want that little tick box, whether you have HIV or not, what symptoms of HIV do you have, are you full-blown AIDS victim, survivor, etc. And it just narrows it down so much. So Srila, I'll go back to you. Thank you so much.
No, actually, Devjyoti, I was wondering if you wanted to maybe say, I mean, given your own comparative work across three contexts, I wondered if you had some reflections on, NGOization in relation to the terrain of organizing and activism in particular. But I mean, you don't have to feel obliged to. I just thought it'd be interesting to, get more of that transnational perspective in.
I think one of the things that I definitely noticed was, given the fact that many of the NGOs that I was affiliated with or worked with received funding from very similar places, a lot of the narratives that were created for the reports were very similar. Having said that, there was always this glossary of terms which goes with every NGO report, right? So you try and be as inclusive as possible, and especially when you come from a place like India or Brazil, there are so many native terms which often get excluded. So there's always that tokenism, that lip service which is done there. However, when it comes to actually reaching out to the population, these projects come in with some amount of money and they think they are like, the new colonial powers, so to say. They come in, they put in some money, they think they've done you a great favor, then they wrap up and disappear without actually creating any sustainability. What happens to those people who were sex workers, for instance, and now are outreach workers? Do they now go back to sex work? What happens to their life? And now, given the conservative circumstances many of these people come from, they have suddenly risen in society only to go back to where they came from, to very harrowing circumstances at times, where your daily bread becomes a matter of negotiation again. And something that I definitely noticed was a very strong lack of understanding, despite a lot of people who are actually working with these international organizations saying that, yeah, I feel uncomfortable about various things that I'm doing, like Francisco mentioned. One time when we were working in Manipur in India, Manipur has a very cash-based economy because of it being a border state, and there are a lot of political issues going on over there. Getting hard receipts was very difficult, and there was like a situation where we got into like daily email conflicts, and if we could access email, that is, with the donors, saying that we don't have any receipts for the 7 rupees that we spent on tea, 20 rupees that we spent on taxi fare. What do we do? This is not Calcutta, Mumbai, New Delhi. We are talking about a place where people lead very precarious lives as a whole. You don't have to just be from a minority. And this understanding seems to totally escape them. So, and I'm not saying that we don't do the same thing, like, we also build our own academic bubble and our ivory towers, but perhaps coming from these contexts we have a better understanding of that reality. So uh, I think I'll stop there and I'll allow the other questions. Thanks, Srila.
Okay, so I think we have at least three questions, and I'll start. I'll start sort of backwards, if I may, with Shilpa's question, because I think it's really interesting how we're talking about, well, a new institutional form and logic, which is the NGO, right? And I feel that Shilpa's question nuances that further to say, what about the further proliferation of other forms like the community-based organization. And I'd be actually curious. I mean, Shilpa's question is obviously specifically to do with India, but I'd be curious to hear about Mozambique and Kenya and what might have been, I mean, what were they similar institutional forms that we saw in the same conjuncture, or were they different? So that's one question. And then Shayantan has contributed very generously, and I think those questions, even though they're for Gauri, I think Francisco and Devjyoti might well want to come in. So the first question to Gauri, which I think is really, really interesting actually, which says, while the HIV/AIDS anti-discrimination movement in India led to the mobilization of queer trans individuals under the public health narrative, similar mobilizations have not happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, barring a few trans queer people asking for vaccines and rations. What do you think the reasons are? And then just finally, which is also a question that goes back to the CBOs, is there a difference? Do you notice a difference between CBOs and NGOs? And again, Francisco, I think I'd be very interested in hearing, what you think. I mean, what you'd say in terms of your own experience of organizations like Lambda. Incidentally, Francisco, this webinar series began, as you know, with a conference that we were doing with Lambda as one of the partners, which was to be held in Maputo, but of course didn't. So I'd love to read your work on Lambda. I have to say I haven't thought of them as an ethnographic object, so I'd be interested to read about that. Just very finally, I wanted to say to Shayantan, but I think all of you would know their work already, is Ani Datta's work on trans organizing and trans rights in India. And I think there's a very interesting way in which Ani's work helps us to move beyond thinking only in terms of transnational donors and the global south, and the West. I mean, just not along that single axis, but to think about the metropolitan and the non-metropolitan, and how, a lot of the difference between NGOs and CBOs might well fall on that line, but basically to look at the varying scales and move beyond just the West and the rest scale. So 3 questions. I hope that was somewhat clear, but they are in your Q&A.
Do you want me to start? Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think this question about the CBO is really important and interesting in the context of AIDS in India. And I can say a little bit about how this sort of translated to Kenya in my research. So, the Gates Foundation's, the national program in India was, one of the kind of models was that the funding would go to an NGO, and then the NGO would be responsible for dispersing the funding to a CBO, and the CBO was community led, and then eventually the program would be handed over to the CBO. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that in practice, so I was doing field work when this handover process was happening, and it was a very fraught kind of process, and a lot of CBOs and NGOs resisted it because they recognized it as a strategy of displacing the responsibility of managing disease onto marginalized groups, right? And leaving them without resources, essentially saying, communities, you deal with it yourself, you know best. We're no longer going to support you with material resources or institutional resources. And so a lot of, CBOs kind of rejected this handover process. And some CBOs, didn't go through the handover process for other reasons, right? Because of all of the things we've talked about around kind of NGO power hierarchies, control, money, bureaucratization, kind of status, and these sorts of dynamics that we also see in the NGO space. So, there was a lot of debate about, what it actually means to hand over to the community, because of course, this idea of the community and community-led organization has become this kind of buzzword in international development spaces. And so, what it means is actually very kind of nebulous and variable depending on the context. So yeah, but I do think that space kind of creates also room for debate about sort of what it actually means to, I've also seen people kind of leverage that language of community to claim control over resources. So I'll also try to address Shayantan's great questions, and I hope we can also be in touch over email after, because probably these are longer conversations, but I think I'll just try to address the question about COVID and sort of why the same kind of mobilization hasn't happened with COVID. Oh, I was also going to say something about Kenya, which is that I think when public health experts try to translate the NGO CBO model to Kenya, one of the things they struggled with was actually that kind of same model of like the NGO and the CBO wasn't present. That a lot of activists I spoke to described this space as much more NGOized. And often kind of there was this like searching for, well, where is the community, like searching for this authentic community that hasn't been organized yet, when in fact there have been so many public health research projects over so many decades in Nairobi that you're never really going to find this kind of pure untouched space of community that's sort of outside of the public health apparatus. It just doesn't exist. So it actually sort of led to some interesting conversations there too about what the community means. And I think like some spaces for activists to take control of the NGO apparatus because they had these new resources and alliances through India. But yeah, so the COVID question, I think all crises are sexual crises, right? So we see that even though COVID isn't technically something that spreads sexually, that there are kind of sexual moralities that shape how people talk about risk and who's behaving in a risky way and who's being responsible or careful. But there are certain groups on which crisis is mapped and disease is sort of localized on those bodies. So in India, I think, especially in the first wave, the figure of the migrant worker kind of took up, rightly, the focus of global institutions. What's interesting, of course, is that, in both the AIDS crisis and COVID, migrant workers and sex workers and queer trans folks, especially those who work on the street, those are overlapping categories, right? So they're both affected by both of these pandemics, right? But these categories sort of separate them and sort of change the terms on which these groups can make claims on the state. And so, it's not that the groups weren't making claims on the state in both instances, but they had much more of a sort of into global institutions and global networks through AIDS than they did with COVID, where they weren't sort of seen as the locus of crisis, even though they were still disproportionately affected by crisis. But I'll also kind of say that, we have to historicize, right, the current fascist regime, which sort of shapes the space for dissent and political claims, and the fact that there has been a generation of queer trans organizing that has sort of created the current situation where, I think there may be less of a feeling that that COVID is sort of a specific moment in which queer trans sex worker organizers can make claims. And I don't think even AIDS was kind of the only reason that these groups mobilized, right? They mobilized based on existing histories of mobilization, and AIDS was kind of something that happened at a key moment to amplify and institutionalize, and sometimes with really negative effects. So, it wasn't like it necessarily was the only reason why activism was amplified or catalyzed. I'll stop there.
Well, trying to respond to you, the first thing is that Lambda, in my view, is like a mix of CBO and NGO, in the way that they, at the same time, make campaigns. They have, their own money, but at the same time, they are thought and they think being like a community organization because they want to serve their communities. People from communities is in the institution. So I think it's like a mix of these two types of organizations. What about the last questions I would like to answer is if the exhaustion of HIV/AIDS funding paradigm. I think the HIV/AIDS funding paradigm survives, but it's being contested, and some of this contestation is about how they do it and how the vocabulary they do it, and how they, for example, one example I had in my research is about when these donors are going to fund some institution, now they are asking to fund the own categories they want to fund. For example, if they want to make a project for lesbian women, they want to spend the money with those women. So they don't want to spend the money with a board, with an organization's board that are only men or only gay guys on. So it's one of type that they are changing these processes. Um, and I think this contestation is changing the process of thinking of these this kind of making social movements and this kind of applying resources, etc. Because now the beneficiaries are not mute. They want to talk, they want to complain about the categories that are used for them, and they want to manage their own money. So things are changing, I guess.
Francisco, do you want to respond to the question around CBOs, community-based organizations, and if they're different from NGOs at all in your specific ethnographic terrain?
So as I said, the only organization I followed is Lambda, which in my opinion is both CBO and NGO, because they do both ways of doing this.
Yes, of course you did. I'm so sorry. Actually, sorry, I got distracted because Kayo's question, which I didn't read out, but you kind of answered it. I think everyone can read it because it's on the chat. But I think it's a really important question, right? So Kayo's asking about a certain exhaustion around the HIV/AIDS funding paradigm as NGOs try to diversify and consolidate their presence in other areas. I wonder if panelists saw in the organizational context in which they worked a sense of trying to escape the sexual health narrative into human rights, for instance. Obviously, Francisco's sort of touched upon it. It'd be interesting to hear what Gauri thinks. But Debjyoti, I was thinking of your work in South Africa, because I think this is particularly part of the South African story around that. Actually, we did it. We solved that problem around AIDS. I remember very early on when I came here, and a sociologist of health told me, no, they only want funding now for tuberculosis, which also I thought was very, very strange, because clearly tuberculosis probably preceded HIV/AIDS. When did tuberculosis sort of recede out of public visibility and come back into public visibility, right? So those are just very interesting. And again, I suppose one must think about whether it's only the transnational that determines the regimes of visibility at particular times, or is it something else? So I was just curious, Debjyoti, if you wanted to say something about the South African perspective.
So just before I speak about South Africa, the Global Fund, for instance, finances things around AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, right? And then they have very specific groups that they want to target in various countries, which is wonderful. But they are putting HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, all three major things together. Now, I think even in South Africa, it is also about the image of the nation. We have beaten something which has been ravaging various parts of this massive continent, right? We have managed to control it. PrEP is available, ART, line 1, line 2, line 3, drugs are available. So what is the point of talking about that anymore? Having said that, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just that the narratives around it have been changed in a very particular manner, and I think India probably is heading the same way, because it is something that has been so heavily looked down upon and very specifically associated with so-called notions of deviant behavior, of promiscuity, and so on, that the focus is being taken away. And through, perhaps it is entirely possible, like we've all done this with, if anyone's worked in an NGO, they know money comes in for a particular stream, then we divert it slightly here and there to make sure various other components get covered. So if there is funding in for tuberculosis, and tuberculosis, as we know, is often one of the secondary infections that comes in when you have late-stage HIV issues, right? Like when your immunity goes for a total toss. So it is important for us to look at it as a larger picture. while trying to get in the funding in the right areas. Because yes, the funding is drying up for HIV in a way, and there are other social issues about mainstreaming. For instance, in India, mainstreaming transgender people after the changes in the laws and regulations have happened. How are they being included into the polity, into their citizenship narratives? How are things changing? And in fact, this actually brings me to Shantam's first question to Gauri. During the COVID-19 pandemic, you saw a very specific type of mobilization within the trans communities in India. And that was also probably because of the extremely restrained voice that NGOs and CPOs have had to have because of the political machinations that have been going on. It has not been easy for people to speak up and get funding in from local parties, from political leaders and so on, to make sure that there's enough food on everyone's plates, to make sure that people's livelihoods are taken care of, because obviously, given the situation, a lot of people lost their jobs, whether across classes. So trans people were extremely badly hit, sex workers were extremely badly hit, and a lot of the help came from within the community. So if you had one meal, you went with half a meal and shared the other half. It was much like that. So the enforced silence that we are going through right now becomes a matter of national security and stability. COVID is a bigger thing, we will focus on that. You are unimportant right now. And I think this has happened multiple times in our histories. It's not something that is totally new. Why are you talking about decriminalizing homosexuality? We have bigger things to deal with right now. So we've all gone through these stages. So I think South Africa's focus on tuberculosis will also become something very similar in India, perhaps with something else, maybe malaria, maybe mangroves, something or the other will come up where we will divert our attention away from HIV.
Gauri, if you want to say something from the context of both India and Kenya in response to Kaya's question. And I think then there's a last one from Shantan, which we could just squeeze in. I'm trying to understand how caste and casteism played out during the HIV/AIDS mobilization in India. Can anybody here direct me to appropriate sources and materials? I mean, yeah, Gauri, I'll let you respond, but Shantan, again, I think Ani's work is also really on point with looking at questions around caste and class and metropolitan privilege in convergence. Yeah, sorry, Gauri, go for it.
So the question about the exhaustion of the HIV/AIDS funding paradigm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of the logic of crisis, right? Is that it's temporary. So once it passes, the groups who were thought to be the center of the crisis are no longer at the forefront of public concern. And I think, Devjyoti, you were talking about this in terms of, livelihoods. Like, what happens when you've spent half your life working in outreach for HIV, and then HIV is kind of no longer a problem. We've solved it, it's done, we've moved on, and now you need to find a new way to kind of earn a livelihood, right? Aside from the sort of, just the status and the networks and the communities you were part of, just really kind of how to get day to day and put food on the table, as you were pointing out. So I think, and I think when I was doing my field work, this transition was just sort of starting to take place, in the sense that the era of large-scale AIDS funding in India was coming to an end. That was why there were these kind of Indian engagements where Indian experts were training people in sub-Saharan Africa and different countries to talk about AIDS management and their success. And so yeah, I mean, I think this is built into the logic of how global institutions manage crisis, right? And it's probably not specific to AIDS, and we'll probably see it in relation to COVID as well. And I think, the organizations and activists that are sort of, as Kayo kind of points out, sort of trying to figure out how to creatively navigate that. are resilient. And what I've seen is that a lot of kind of smaller organizations haven't been able to sort of weather this. So after AIDS was no longer a source of funding, they weren't able to continue their work. A lot of them closed down or, radically scaled down their work and weren't able to kind of operate. And I think this has played out differently for different groups. And I think, as Shayanthan has pointed out in the chat, we have, these terms encompass so many different groups and nuances. And I think, to also sort of start to get at the caste question, I think we see caste inequality, class inequality playing out in sort of which groups have been able to continue their work after AIDS, and which groups haven't. And I think I was also going to point to Anidata's work about caste. And I think I can email you. I've read some sort of kind of Dalit critiques of the HIV industrial complex and sort of what it's done for queer politics that I can send you over email. But yeah, I think it's kind of a question that gets at sort of how inequalities have been baked into sort of the trajectory of queer politics and sex worker politics to some extent too, though in a different way in India. I think in Kenya, from the interviews I have done, I felt this really acutely. I think, in Kenya, the narrative was less around AIDS is over when I was doing research, but there was a sense that, we were now competing for resources in a way that we weren't even like 5 years ago. So I was doing my fieldwork in 2012. So, there was a sense of like the crisis isn't as easy of a pathway to resources as it once was. And what that meant was kind of, some concrete limitations, but also in some ways opportunities to articulate politics differently, right? So sex worker organizations in Kenya, in some ways, like moving beyond AIDS has allowed some more radical frameworks, right? And alliance building, like the African Sex Workers Alliance, and kind of working across country. And that work is sort of catalyzed by some AIDS resources, but also, goes far beyond that, right? So I always think about one activist I interviewed who said, like, we survived AIDS, like in some ways that it was just this big kind of moment of this influx of large amounts of funding and experts and people from global institutions kind of imposing terminologies and ideas and, it opened up some opportunities, but the removal of that actually allows for some kind of different ways of thinking, organizing politically.
Yeah, and also the fact that, obviously, which identity categories were visibilized by the global AIDS crisis, right? And the obvious one that wasn't was the lesbian. And so actually, Kayo's question about, of course, one can't posit a sort of linear trajectory, but, from AIDS to human rights, who benefited from it? Who benefited from, lesbian rights are human rights at Beijing, which is all of these kind of completely invisibilized queer feminist groups, right? So I don't know, it's just really, I'm always just struck by, of course, here, spatially all of these resonances, but I think, Gauri, in your case, like just I'm disappointed no one asked a question about the African students and policing them. I didn't know that at all, actually. I'm quite embarrassed. But and maybe that should be a whole other conversation for another time, because we're as ever over time. But so thank you so much for sticking on, and actually to all our attendees who are still here. Again, I don't always feel this way, but I really feel like I've learned a lot from all three of you. So thank you so much. And just to tell everyone who's still with us that we're going to have our last session of season 1. Don't worry, there will be season 2. But our last session is on the 23rd, and it's going to be a really, really brilliant one. So please keep an eye out for all that publicity when it comes. And thank you again so much. This was just a fabulous conversation. Keep well.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you for your questions.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Francisco.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.